right, thanks everybody for joining the roundtable. My name is Paul Culling. I'm VP of Alliances for Americas for GTM Hub. I'm here as your moderator today. And so, my role at the company is I work with all of our partners, helping our customers with their OKR success. I'm really excited to be here as a moderator with Evan and Ryan. This roundtable will be recorded, and you will get access to that recording after the fact. So you'll receive an email with a recorded event and some helpful content and that kind of thing. We encourage you to participate in the discussion through the chat. There is a Q&A panel. There's a chat panel. You can use either or to pose questions. We have Marta on the line as well. She'll be helping moderate and be in the background, organizing questions and that kind of thing so that we can get those to the panelists. I wanted to introduce our panelists today. So our first is Ryan Lockard. He is the Global CTO of Cloud Technology at Cognizant, seasoned industry professional with a background in enterprise financial services, manufacturing, life sciences, healthcare, and other areas. He has served at all levels of the technology spectrum with an intent focus on building teams and delivering compounding value. Ryan is frequently invited to keynote internationally at industry conferences, was a contributing author to a book on DevSecOps, and is often quoted, cited in industry publications and several doctoral thesis papers. This isn't written in my notes, but I happen to know that he also is a key advisor to some CTOs at the largest banks and other large organizations. Our other panelist is from GTM Hub. That's Evan Campbell, Chief Transformation Officer at our company. He's a senior technology and business executive, management consultant. As an executive and entrepreneur, he's demonstrated success with 2 IPOs and 2 exits to public companies. Evan has held CTO, VP of Product Development, and VP of Professional Services roles in public, private, and venture-funded companies in several different industries. Evan has extensive management consulting expertise in innovation, product development, and digital, agile, and DevOps transformation to help clients realize peak performance and competitive advantage. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out the roundtable with a short presentation by Evan. That's sort of going to set the stage for us, and then we're going to move into kind of having more of a discussion around that. And Ryan, as always, feel free to jump in and tell Evan where he's wrong or how you feel, or this should be like a discussion. But we'll start with this little presentation, and then we'll move from there. Good. So over to you, Evan.
Thanks, Paul. I'm excited, really excited and appreciative to have Ryan with us, because he really is an expert CTO himself. And as Paul said, really a trusted advisor to CTOs of some of the biggest companies around the world. But I really quickly, I felt it was important to set the stage that OKRs are primarily a strategy deployment and strategy execution framework. OKRs are really popular, they're booming, but a lot of times OKRs are used as kind of a tactical employee goal setting framework as part of the performance management system, which actually destroys their effectiveness as a strategy deployment and execution methodology. So what is strategy? It's your intent as an organization. It's what are you trying to achieve, not how you're going to achieve it. I particularly like, for simplicity, Roger Martin's approach of where are you going to play in your industry? How will you win in that playground? And how will you know you have won, which is essentially a key result. Now, this roundtable, like most of them targeted at horizontal thinkers, assumes that you know what an OKR is. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about what's a good objective, what's a bad objective. So we're just going to jump in and talk about OKRs and specifically the CTO role. So strategy methodology, just so we're all clear what strategy deployment and execution is. strategy really has three major components as a process or methodology. The first, obviously, is developing your strategy, formulating your strategy. This is mission, vision. Oftentimes at that point, 3-year objectives across the enterprise, 5-year objectives if you're kind of a slow capital intensive business. Those can be expressed as OKRs. Strategy deployment is the process where objectives, goals are promulgated throughout the organization. It's a communication process so that every part of the organization understands the high-level strategy, but more importantly, how their unique job, their passions, their role in the organization, they and their team, what's most important for them to do tomorrow to advance the strategic objectives of the company. And this can be yearly and quarterly OKRs as you're getting down to business units, divisions, product lines, et cetera. And then strategy execution is this more bottom-up process where you're actually tracking whether the work that's being funded, the initiatives that are undertaken by the organization are or are not realizing strategic objectives of the company. So it's kind of governing that process and tracking what's working or not so that we can intervene. Now, strategy deployment and strategy execution are really hard. And a lot of organizations, even big, competent, successful organizations, really struggle with it because there are a lot of things in traditional organizations that actually maximize strategy decay. Strategy decay occurs when you take too long or there's distortion in the message as it's promulgating through the organization. And strategy decay will really destroy your organization's ability to get everyone aligned and working and focused on the most important things. It'll actually undermine the success of your strategy. What I've seen many, many times as well is that organizations will put a lot of effort into developing a strategy or pay millions of dollars to one of the famous strategy consulting firms, and they'll have this beautiful strategy built in PowerPoint or documents. And years later, in some cases, I've witnessed that they have not deployed that strategy at all. It's still sitting as a bunch of PowerPoint decks or 3-ring binders on the CEO's desk, and they never really figured out how to deploy that strategy through the organization. So the capstone message is, a great strategy is very helpful, but if you can't deploy it, I'd much rather have, a B- strategy that we deployed and executed really well than an A+ strategy that we can't deploy and execute at all. So, everybody's familiar with the OKR superpowers. We're going to talk about how these align to the responsibilities of the CTO in a minute. These superpowers translate into productivity and effectiveness and competitiveness for the organization. Now, the CTO that we're primarily talking about today, because there are a lot of different kinds of CTOs in roles in different types of organizations. We're primarily talking about large, non-digital native, traditional enterprises, banks, insurance companies, manufacturing, where software is not, or technology is not the primary product of the organization. So we're really talking to the Fortune 1000 CTOs who are working in these more traditional industries. So there are different models of where the CTO reports in the org chart. And in particular, number 4 on here would be representative of a software company. But I'm going to posit, and Ryan, I invite you to, to elaborate this or challenge me, but I'm going to posit that for most traditional large enterprises, the model number 3, where the CIO and the CTO are essentially peers in the org chart, is most common. So that'll help everybody understand when we're talking about the CTO's responsibilities and challenges, this is the CTO that we're talking about, the one in the large traditional enterprise. So in the white paper that I put out associated with this campaign, I posited 5 or 6 primary responsibilities of the enterprise CTO. It's developing technology strategy and roadmaps, exploration and exploitation of new and emerging technologies, integrating and rationalizing the technology portfolio of the company, helping elevate the performance and quality of the organization broadly, ensuring efficient, profitable, and secure use of technologies and the measures to enforce those standards. And then frequently, the CTO is the outward-facing representative of the technology story to external stakeholders, prospects, et cetera. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ryan and Paul at this point and turn off the presentation, and let's turn this into a fun conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, so I think that that's a really good segue into our kind of 3 core roundtable topics. The first being kind of what is the enterprise CTO role? What does that look like? What are the responsibilities? If you haven't had a chance to read through that white paper yet, do so. If you haven't, if you misplaced it, I believe it was part of this program of when you signed up, but we will be forwarding that on to you, so you will get another copy of it. So what is the enterprise CTO role? What are the responsibilities? We'll move then into sort of what are the challenges and enablers of those roles and responsibilities. And then we'll kind of finish off with how do OKRs help with that. So I'm just going to put it back to people smarter than I am to kind of dig into. So I know, Ryan, you've taken a look at those roles and responsibilities. Where do you see like things that Evan's missed? Things that you can sort of like add on to, that kind of thing.
Right. So obviously there's nothing in the list that I would debate, right? When it comes down to the functions of the CTO in the common era. The one that I would add in, and it's not the most earth-shattering bit, is there's absolutely a war on talent today with the great resignation upon us. The role of the CTO is there's a stitching between the 6 functions that Evan presented that's important to make sure that you protect and retain the talent that you have, and also become a magnet for future talent, which is literally just make engineering safe for the engineers. Finding ways to, it comes in that motion of emerging technology as a core function. Being an advocate out there in the public and internally to raise up internal practitioners, talking about the developer experience, talking about the engineer experience within the organization, and basically being a champion of what good engineering looks like inside of that firm, and inviting others to join it, because you want to give people that purpose inside of the organization to hold on to those engineers that are in extreme demand today. I mean, Evan, I'm curious, you and I haven't talked about that too much before, but I kind of see that as sort of like this, the DNA that ties all 6 together. I'm curious if you would agree or disagree with that.
I think you make a great point, Ryan. And it really does stitch a lot of these things together. I mean, you and I have both had the opportunity to lead software development organizations, and we invest a lot in developing people. I mean, a high performance software craftsmanship centric development organization, oftentimes you and I have had to make the investment to get those skills, that knowledge, that mastery of the craft. They don't come out of college with a CS degree, in my experience, not the ones I've hired. And in a lot of cases, it's hard to hire people on the market that have really, mastered zero defect software craftsmanship culture. And man, once you get the teams that are humming along like that, it's crushing to have employee turnover. And everything you said is spot on. I mean, that mastery and that purpose that Daniel Pink talks about as knowledge worker motivation. Well, yeah, that's a CTO can help with that, and OKRs can help the CTO get there.
Yeah. And our background, there's a bit of synergy between you and I, and it's pretty safe to say when our phone rings from a company that's looking for you or I to provide services, they're not in a well-functioning mode. They're typically in need of some help. So I think that promotion of what good looks like, or what good could look like internally, is massive. I also think, even to this day, most of the companies that I'm working with, there's a desire for change. There's a desire for better. And I think your first principle was around establishing good strategy. And a lot of the organizations I work with, you hear about change fatigue. You hear about these organizations that really, we can't take on too much more change. We put these people through so much. The pandemic has been a forcing factor so much on these folks. Any more change, and we're afraid we're going to lose people. And I think one of the more compelling bits that I usually push back on that message with is people are not afraid of change. They're afraid of change with no direction or change without understanding or intent. So defining that strategy and being very declarative on what the better version of our organization looks like, how can we improve who we are to be something better, and then making change, like micro changes inside either the operating model or inside the tech stack or inside the vocabulary of the organization that is largely in service to that larger strategy. As long as that becomes obvious, or at least we create that connective tissue between the changes and the strategy itself, that change fatigue is mitigated down to the point where it's not even really declared. When you hear about change fatigue, it's usually spoken about in organizations where that strategic leadership oversight of what the strategy is not clearly communicated or believed by the larger body.
That's a great point. I mean, I love that line of thinking. I think your point that change hurts in brittle organizations is really salient. Resilient organizations are learning organizations, and they're set up to learn and adapt and experiment and probe. And this day and age, we know those are the organizations that win because, the big don't eat the small, the fast eat the slow. And the way that you win in the market is not by concentrating competitive advantage in your massive size. It's by adapting to market changes, environmental changes faster than the other organization. And your mission and vision as an organization doesn't change. It doesn't break because of COVID. Your tactics for how you get there shift. But as you say, a resilient organization just sees that as a different, more successful path to the same destination.
There's that, I hate doing the meme thing, but there's that meme that I've seen on LinkedIn or Reddit or whatever, time and time again, that kind of just synthesizes all of this down to a perfectly fine distillate. What happens if we invest all of this time and money into change and people leave? And then the obvious answer is, what if we don't and everybody stays, right? You have to move with the times. You have to, every morning you wake up, you have to reinvent yourself to be a better version of who you were yesterday, as a person, as a team, and as an enterprise. And I think that hunger in those nimble organizations is what allows their stock price to go up, what allows for their revenue or their profitability to rise time and time again, and they retain the talent that they're looking for. I think there's something material to that, right? And again, almost all of it anchors back to strong leadership, strong strategy, and strong communication that oftentimes are fueled through a framework such as the OKR framework.
One of the things that we talk about as a responsibility of a CTO, I mean, they're really, at least as far as the realm of technology, they're the ones that are doing that probing and that experimentation. And I think we've both done work in innovation consulting. There's innovation is exploration, it's creative, but it also has to be directed innovation, right? I mean, if you're a consumer packaged goods company and the innovation group comes back with how to build an aircraft carrier, they haven't really served the mission of the organization. So how do OKRs and kind of that alignment to the strategy help the CTO also be exploratory, innovative, and ideally disruptive?
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here because as one would expect, I outlined kind of 3 areas we're going to touch.
Did I already screw up the agenda?
Then we'll talk about that, and we're just sort of jumping all through all of them, which is totally cool because that's the best way to have conversations. But I did want to kind of jump back a minute and ask both of you on the whole roles and responsibilities thing. What do you think maybe that isn't on that list of 6 that was from the, what do you think that there's a role or responsibility that people don't generally think of from like a CTO perspective, like some role or responsibility they have that people don't think of that maybe is missing in some organizations? Is there anything like that?
Well, I think Ryan, came up with a good one, that in The Great Resignation, making the technology organization a sexy, exciting place to join and stay is really important. In terms of what gets ignored out of these, I wonder, Ryan, do you think that CTOs fully embrace the responsibility of trying to make the whole technology delivery organization better, or sometimes is that just too hard of a lift?
It's funny, when I answer these questions, I typically think about the best CTOs I've ever worked with. I rarely think about my own starting posture. But I also am drawn towards like Snowden's Cynefin framework and realizing what reality you're starting from. If you're in an area of chaos and you're trying to optimize the whole system in one go, you're going to hit utter failure immediately. But if there's a relative state of calm where you can focus on rising the tide to lift all the boats, you have a better opportunity for success. Given again the types of organizations I tend to gravitate towards, they're a little bit closer to that chaos realm. And that's not to say they're in chaos. There's some strategic objective that they're trying to accomplish, and they're looking for a little bit of help with that. With that said, I think there's this whole proliferation of, there's a natural motion that I'm seeing most of the CTOs that I'm working with personally that are trying to elevate the behavior or the operating model of the entire engineering organization. But what they try to do is they come up with exemplar teams that are just living what great looks like, either leveraging seed and split methodologies or sexier versions of things like dojos or other frameworks that are allowing for those capabilities. And it's all capability based. It's not throughput based. It's not metric based. It's literally how can we build better nucleuses of teams that are indexed against capabilities and create instrumentation and some telemetry around that, and figuring out how can we actually then make that more the standard. And here's some free consulting from Ryan. The way that I typically work with clients on this is, think of it, I had this conversation with a CTO last week. Think of it as an internal go-to-market campaign. Find a team that is performing relatively well, but they're mission focused, they're outcome focused, and they're driving towards something amazing. And really fall in love with that team and fall in love with the problem that they're solving. Create a case study, an internal case study, something that never leaves the four walls of this organization, and come up with a problem solution outcome based framework that talks about the team's journey, and make it small, right? It doesn't have to be something that takes many quarters, God, many years. No, I'm talking like something in 2 to 3 months that we can demonstrate material value, both technically and business focused, and get some anecdotal surrounding quotes involved, like the architects, the BAs, God forbid the product owners or the product management organizations. And if we're so bold as to talk to users, maybe we get some user feedback in there as well. And then use that as an internal vehicle for change inside the organization. And if you're using an OKR framework, index the outcomes against the objectives that we were driving towards. And that then creates a safety harness to invite other teams into modeling what good looks like in that organization. Hopefully that was a little bit on the mark there.
No, I love that though.
That was awesome.
What you're talking about is just good organizational change management, and any change in large traditional organizations. I mean, they're very much optimized for the status quo, and they have really powerful antibodies that attack and kill any attempted change to that status quo. And so you have to be really deliberate about it. And the lighthouse pattern of creating real excellence celebrating it, communicating it, using it as an example, and then federating more cases of that excellence is a really good pattern. It's exactly how we roll out OKRs, how we advise the change management around implementing OKRs. But I love your point there, Ryan.
It's got a nested objection handling framework associated with it as well. It's like you take away the objection that would never work here, or we don't have the tools for this, or we don't have the appetite for change. If you can actually prove it, rather than have somebody like me come in and say, right, this is what good looks like. Well, this guy doesn't work here. He doesn't even have a laptop from our organization. Use your own internal proof points or existing partners, or whatever you have at your disposal. But there's something that struck me when you were going through the slides. Somewhere in the middle, you had a very sweet Lamborghini, and next to it, you had, I guess,
a jalopy.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, a jalopy. And that comes back to where does strategy fall apart? And unfortunately, sometimes the strategy is intended. It starts with good intent, but the execution is done poorly. Maybe it gets off PowerPoint and into the culture of the organization. Like there's a very amazing company that I've had the absolute privilege of working with for a little while now. And when I started with them, it was actually the CIO. So it wasn't this is not a CTO story, but the CIO in my mind is more of a hybrid CIO CTO because he actually asked me to do a code review with him one time, which was fun. But when we're talking about the operating model of this organization, they explained to me the way the incentive model works, and I'll be brief. But imagine starting January 1st with 100 tokens in your piggy bank. And at the end of the year, however many tokens you have left influences how much bonus you get. And in this model, your bonus is heavily, you have a lot of total comp based on your bonus. Your base isn't necessarily at market rate, but with your bonus, you're well above market rate if you hit 100%. Now, the way you lose tokens, by the way, you can't earn tokens back. You can only lose tokens. It's a great system. The way you lose tokens, a bug makes it to production, you lose a token. A release is delayed, you lose a token. Something's misconfigured in production, you lose a token. User complains about a feature you released, you lose a token, right? Those are somewhat based in reality, but almost everything has to do with creating customer dissatisfaction via production change. So now here I am, a very simple mammal that's crawling this rock for as long as I can. I'm thinking to myself, I need to get as many of these tokens in the piggy bank at the end of the year, keep as many as I can at the end of the year. And every single time I make a production change, I run the risk of losing tokens. I know how I can beat the system.
Never release anything.
Nope. Why should I? All I'm going to do is lose money. Every time I hit push to production, I'm going to lose money. So the jalopy in that case isn't necessarily the strategy that wasn't implemented. It was the manifestation of a good strategy that ultimately over time morphed into something different. So when I worked with this client, like I was there to help them with setting up some Kafka streams and setting up a CI/CD framework, some infrastructure configuration as code, migrating to AWS, all the really, and Kubernetes, I got to say Kubernetes just that I get full bingo credit here. all the really cool things, right? And I remember when we had this initial conversation, he and I were not in the relationship that we're in now, which is very stable. I looked at him like, there's no sense in doing any of this. Like, you're better off doing absolutely nothing until we address the strategic issue that you have in front of you. Technology is not the problem yet. I look forward to the day that we make technology the problem. We have an operating model problem. We have a system health problem that we need to address first. And sure enough, we actually did attack that with our horns and, whittled it down. It's not completely gone, but we whittled it down to something that we can proudly say allows engineers to be engineers again inside that system. Mm-hmm. So when I looked at that, it kind of struck me as interesting. Yeah, there is absolutely, hey, let's go pay someone $30 million to tell us things we already know that cannot be implemented here. Versus let's actually start going out and making meaningful change. But there's also then the hybrid of pay someone a bunch of money, implement it wrong, and holy crap, we've actually created a more broken version of ourselves. Curious if you see that ever.
I do. I mean, I think we experience a lot of superficial things that are labeled transformation. And at heart, I think part of what you're getting at is also, we talked about, you made some good points about organizational change management. There's also, we talked a little about a learning organization, but a key part of that is a continuous improvement culture, where the organization really has a commitment to constantly measure outcomes, not just the outputs that are easy to measure with the metrics that are convenient, but focus on outcomes, use theory of constraints thinking to identify what our real bottlenecks are, not the superficial ones, and then focus on a few things that we're going to fix that are most impactful so that we can get them fixed as fast as possible with minimum distraction. Of course, this all sounds very much like the OKR superpowers. But I agree completely. I got into OKRs through enterprise portfolio management consulting, because it's really hard to prioritize an unbounded, infinite list of demand requests for capacity when nobody agrees on what represents value. So you always end up going back to decibel driven decision making, or hippo decision making, the highest paid person's opinion, driving everything that gets funded, and you get the same pathologies that we're familiar with. So I saw OKRs as a fix to that.
Decibel driven decision making. I'm stealing that one. So it's funny, as you were talking, I was racking my brain. Where did I first get introduced to OKRs? And I wish I had like this magnificent story where I was walking the halls of Google one day and they told, no, it was actually, believe it or not, it was a product management training that I went to begrudgingly. I've never been a product manager, and I have very little desire to do that. That sounds like a really hard job to me. But in that training itself, I started learning about OKRs. This must have been at least 10, maybe 15 years ago. And I remember hearing about it as a really cool pseudo hippie sounding way of doing, strategy and goal management. And here I am 15 years later, completely in love with the idea as a way to make change visible, but also make strategy actionable. Which as you were talking, and I'm racking my brain here thinking, where was the first time I've seen it? It was back then. And since then, it's literally been something that I've been deploying not only in my consulting, in my internal change management inside the large organization that I work for today. Don't ever tell my wife this, but I leverage OKRs inside of the house, inside the family. I'm not declarative on it there. I'm not stupid, but we use that as a way to put purpose and direction around where we're heading as a family.
I love it. So I'm going to steal Paul's facilitator thunder a little bit, but what are, the CTO job, and you and I have had experience with a lot of different models, with a lot of different CTOs, with a lot of different responsibilities kind of put on them in different ways. But what are some of the things that make the job hard or challenging, kind of frustrate the ability to deliver these areas of responsibility that we've been talking about?
Again, I'm gonna draw down on some of the best ones I've worked with and the pain that they've expressed to me. Often the CTOs that I'm working with are relatively new to the organization because the organization has decided they need to change the status quo. So they either promote somebody in that's relatively new, or they hire from the outside in. And when you do that, you used the term of an antibody earlier, like being an antibody inside the system. If you're new in the role, you're typically going to be, you're going to meet resistance, either implicit or explicit, because you're new. That whole muscle memory of, an organization, most of the organizations I'm working with are pretty large. They've been around for a long period of time. So they have generations of success. Not years, not decades, generations of proven success over the ways they've been doing things. And anybody that comes in and tries to move the needle a little bit towards something different is typically going to be met with resistance. There's one client that I'm working with today where I went to dinner with some folks for the first, COVID's opening up so I can travel a little bit again. And we had dinner with like 6 or 7 people, and they were just doing introductions. And somebody said, "Oh, I've only been with the firm for 10 years, so I'm still new." Holy hell. Imagine trying to make change in an organization where you have people introducing themselves as basically an intern after 10 years. I think that's one of the biggest change inhibitors. The other is, unfortunately, there's plenty of people like transformation sells. And I don't need to really say that to you too much, but there's as for every good transformation consultant or transformation minded person, there's probably 2 or 3 snake oil salesmen out there. And unfortunately, folks, CTOs are finding themselves in organizations where they're met with, yeah, we've heard this before, it doesn't stick around here. And you're getting that level of resistance as well as the muscle memory. So I think that's kind of when you went back, you used the term the lighthouse project, going through and finding a way to demonstrate this is real, this is measurable, this drives outcomes, and this is rewarded, is basically the antidote to that antibody.
One of the things that I think makes the CTO role difficult in traditional organizations is, usually in those settings, the CTO and the CIO are sort of peers. The CTO is this big brained visionary, and the office of the CTO may have, some architects and some enterprise architects, some innovation leads of various types, and they're big thinkers, and they're probing. They're also looking at the existing kind of portfolio of technology assets, which in a large traditional company, as you know, is hundreds or thousands of systems that have emerged over decades, right? So they may have everything from mainframes running COBOL. They probably still have a bunch of enterprise Java, and then they've got all of this emergent, JavaScript and multi-tenant cloud stuff. And so the CTO is trying to rationalize this, is trying to make these systems intercommunicate as efficiently as possible, and trying to assert some standards to maximize return on assets from these code bases, some of which are highly impaired with technical debt. And so, let's say he's saying, just for an example, that, all of the J2EE applications should use the enterprise service bus in this manner. And, the more modern apps should all have microservices exposed for any public method, just to throw some simplistic examples out there. But he's not the one nobody on his team, nobody in his org chart is actually writing any of the code that he's trying to enforce the standards around, right? So he has to influence the CIO. But in the traditional IT organizations, the CIO's got a bunch of silos around functional specialties that he can barely influence, because there are local optimizations for the the test organization leader, the mainframe development leader, and another development leader, and not to mention the great point you made about the misalignment of dev and ops around misaligned incentives. So the CTO has to be an influencer. But there might be thousands of people that he's trying to change the behavior of in the CIO's organization. Is that, to me, that's one of the most difficult things about being a successful enterprise CTO.
Oh, hell yeah. And that extends beyond just the CTO-CIO relationship. I can't even tell you how many times I'm prepping CTOs for conversations with CFOs or COOs to really go into the Thunderdome and battle for budget, and make sure that oftentimes those mainframe environments need to be protected. Like, those are typically going to be the backbone of any I'm actually going to say it, any digital organization still has a bunch of mainframe applications running.
Yeah, and the only guys left that can code it are crusty old guys like me.
Yeah, I was going to say, people are actually older than me, so you took the bullet. But I think that's like, so there was a question that actually just came through the chat a little bit ago about what are some examples of OKRs that CTOs can work with. And I think, in the white paper, you address 2 or 3 different patterns for that. But in what you just described, I think, one of the OKRs could literally be make our services, our products as resilient as the competition. And that in itself is a strong objective. And then the key results would be things around, upgrading the top 2 down services within the mainframe stack, or migrate legacy Java code into much more resilient languages. And I'd like to say something novel about JavaScript, but I'm smart enough to know I don't touch JavaScript.
And the OKR superpowers, right? In this case, and it's part of the conversation of coaching CTOs to speak to CFOs is, right, you've got to talk about the enterprise strategy, the strategic objectives of the business that we all serve, right? So how is uptime and stability and resilience and adaptability of our technology stack, of our software assets that enable the business, how are those objectives directly supporting or delivering the strategic agility and growth objectives of the line of business, the P&L?
Yeah.
And the cool thing about the focus superpower is that it's a trump card that ideally overcomes the parochial local optimizations of the bureaucracies, right? I mean, these are still industrial era organizational structures that are organized around functional specialties in a lot of these organizations. This is not good because we're no longer an industrial era economy. We're a digital economy, but a lot of these organizations haven't addressed their organizational design pathologies. So the trump card of OKR focus says, you, the test department leader, you, the development department leader, you, the ops leader, all have goals that you impose on your silos locally. And I'm demanding that you deprioritize those against a strategic objective expressed in an OKR at the organizational level. And I can do that because that's what we all have to align to. And that should be part of the toolbox that a CTO can use to set the why.
1,000%. And then that then manifests itself in the CTO role as ultimate accountability for the brokerage of those departmental objectives, the stitching that kind of glues it all together and creates the symphony that is the story back to the business about how those federated teams are actually operating in orchestration towards the larger objectives that we set as a business. 100%. And make sure that we stay resilient to the fact that this is where we are headed. This is how we measure. This is how we improve. This is how we deliver at speed and scale. Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes from Jeffrey Moore, who I just admire immensely across a whole bunch of things. I mean, he's just such a genius with product marketing, but I love the quote. He said, you know what? Everybody's a technology company. What's a bank anymore? A bank is just a big computer with a marketing department.
Yeah, and a banking license. That's the thing. That's where the value is in the regulatory approval to do it.
Yeah. And who's on the, I get frustrated. I was just doing some reading while I was putting together the white paper, and I kept running into these articles that were kind of positing with great certainty and pomposity that the CIO has to be really aligned with the business. The CIO has to really understand the strategy in the business, and the CTO just has to be a technology expert. And I kept just having this really visceral reaction that's just so wrongheaded. The CTO is the one that's probing the future of the business and laying the roadmap for the future of the business as it becomes more and more explicitly a technology and digitally driven organization. I think a CTO in some ways is driving the profit centers of the business and has to be as much or more of a business visionary as a CIO. And I don't mean this to denigrate who's running a cost center, essentially, a lot of it.
Well, I think, Evan, I think it's not unique to the CTO, because I think what it's the CTO, the CIO, it's the alignment to the overall strategic objectives of the organization is there for everyone in the organization, including the CTO. And I think, Chris had asked that question, some examples of OKRs that CTOs work with. Ryan, you kind of talked through some of that. I think there's two elements to it. There's the element of these are OKRs we work with within our organization. We can now see how they align to the broader objectives and outcomes and strategic alignment for the organization. And that also helps in that conversation we had the other day about like going to ask for funding for certain things, being able to show how doing that will aligns to the broader goals of the organization. And so gives a framework, and which leads me to Kurt has asked, any experience or anecdotes about frameworks that encourage and facilitate ideas from engineering to bubble up and influence strategy? If we've succeeded in hiring a very talented team, we should let their ideas shine. Can you work with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some items out there like Jürgen Appello has the Management 3.0 organization / organizational construct, where they talk about things like innovation days, where there's reserved time for teams to work on ideas that are either paying down technical debt and making the system better for others, to, hey, I have a new product idea that may be beneficial to this organization, and taking those innovation days and almost doing like a big sprint review from them, where you can take those ideas and ladder them up into almost like an executive Shark Tank type people. That's one example. Another is literally just inviting executives to demos or to sprint reviews or whatever flavor of SDLC you're buying into. Either if you're an executive, be accountable to the teams and show up so you can actually see who's leading from the front. Or if you're running a team, employ your senior leadership to come and just start seeing some of the goodness that's happening from within, and allow that probing conversation to begin there. I have seen like actual Shark Tank days where teams are pitching ideas. Oftentimes, they come with the idea that one team will win, and we'll follow that through, which that level of competition doesn't always get perceived as well as some things like the innovation days. Google has a pretty interesting approach for this as well. I don't know why I've mentioned Google so many times today. I apologize. But they actually reserve capacity of teams to focus on making the tools better. And things like Gmail and some of the other products that have come through what was once called Google Labs literally started as internal house cleaning. Actually, I think that's the genesis of Kubernetes itself. It started off as a side project of some product development teams to handle planetary scale of workload distribution. It started off as a thing called Borg. There were a few folks inside of Google that said, hey, we have an idea here that we may be able to make the system better for everybody and for our customers. And they started just dedicating time towards it. Obviously, it grew and it grew and it grew. It became its own product team, and then got open sourced and all that good stuff. But you can kind of see and this goes back to something Evan said earlier, a learning organization will always find a way to make time to learn. If learning is not prioritized in the organization, then you're never going to have the opportunity. Evan, I'm going to turn it to you. Anything you would add to what I just shared?
I thought that was a great answer. A couple little things. I've done a fair amount of work creating innovation ecosystems, and that's what this really is, right? I mean, a suggestion box in the corner without the ability of the organization to align innovation to the strategy, fund emergent ideas, and then ultimately ingest or incorporate new business and product opportunities into the business model. Those are all things that are essential in an innovation ecosystem. I mean, we're all familiar with the stories of the brilliant Park, research center that invented the graphical user interface, invented the mouse, invented just a long list of fantastic product innovations, and Xerox wasn't able as an organization to ingest and exploit any of these brilliant things that their R&D group came up with. One of the models, I thought Ryan provided a couple of nice examples. One other that I'll throw in there to read up on is Adobe's Kickbox model. Adobe has a formal program where as any employee in the organization can make a pitch for them or a small group to explore an idea that they have. And the Kickbox is kind of a kit, and there's some supporting, funding and time to allow them to run their experiment. And then it moves into kind of a Shark Tank conversation where a certain number of these proposed business or product ideas will be funded for an additional bigger stage of work where you're actually trying to get to problem solution fit. And it's, it's a really good model.
I like that. That sounds cool.
So I'm going to pull us back. We're coming up on time. Chris had a follow-up, which I think is a really important thing for you both to talk about. How about timing related to quarterly goals? With the example you gave, making our products as resilient as the competition, I can imagine some projects can be done quicker, more steadily, or more predictable than others. And I think one of the things that really pops out there is talking about timing, right? So, so can you guys talk about that?
I think when I went to that product, I swear I'm going to answer the question. Just let me take 3 lefts to make the right here. When I went to that product management training 10, 15 years ago, the example of the OKR that was given, and I imagine it's been given thousands of times, if not more, in some sort of pattern like this, was our objective is to go to the moon. In 1968, they wanted to go to the moon. The first key result was, shit, we need to build a launch pad. So the goal of getting to the moon, it does not have to be realized like in the first 6 months. But we should be able to understand how we're going to build the launch pad, how we're going to build the scaffolding. I'm not a rocket scientist, so I'm going to call it scaffolding. They kind of nest up to the big fuselage thing that they shoot up into the sky. You don't have to get too done with the first iteration, with the first quarter, but what you're doing should be in service to getting to done. So in my example of building the most resilient product, service, or platform, maybe, the first quarter is all just based around defining what the telemetry elements and the measures are that define resiliency for our service. The first quarter could just be literally agreeing on terms, which oftentimes seems to be the most overlooked problem in a lot of the technical arenas that I work. Maybe it's a little bit more than that. Maybe it's not just defining the reliability terms, but also looking through and indexing how many SLAs we breached with existing contracts of users or customers. And then ultimately stepping down into something along the lines of, okay, let's start putting in an instrumentation framework. Let's start capturing some of the uptime, downtime measures. And then we can start strangling out which services are the biggest culprits. And then Q2, maybe, depending on how big your problem is, maybe Q2 is then strangling down those services that are causing the most outages, or putting better unit tests around those services, creating more data fidelity, whatever it is that's actually causing the outages, and continuously teasing that out using theory of constraints until it's no longer the biggest constraint in that broken system. Evan, you always have something brilliant to add, so I'm gonna stop there and see if
I thought you nailed it, but just to be really tactical, Chris, to Chris Jones, the guy who asked the question, sometimes you're going to achieve an OKR in less than a quarter, and then you'll have 2 or 3 OKRs, and they won't all absorb the entire quarter. In other cases, you'll have an objective that carries out for 3 or more quarters, but you're going to change the KRs. This is exactly what Ryan said. You're going to change the KRs by the second quarter and the third quarter. If the objective is to have a 0 defect, 0 technical debt software asset, maybe the first quarter KR is to have 50% unit test coverage and a certain target for cyclomatic complexity and one for duplication. And then the next quarter you're getting better, and the next quarter you're getting better. And then, the objective is really fulfilled by the third quarter. So I think that's exactly what Ryan was saying.
Yeah.
So we're at about 10:57 Pacific. I'm not going to make any time zone changes. So we're about 3 minutes off the top. If there's anything you guys want to say just to kind of close things out, I think we'll close it out. We will be following up with everybody with a link to the recording, making sure you have the white paper, and we will follow up with all those that have attended and those that weren't able to make it. So anything in the closing comments from Ryan and Evan?
I mean, I'll just close with this. I appreciate, the invite to this panel. This was probably more fun than I've ever gotten paid to do before in my life. So I appreciate you guys for that. Great content. Love the white paper. So if you have not downloaded and read that, I'd give that one more plug. Last thing for me, I'll be, if you want to catch up more on this and you're planning to attend AWS reInvent next month, actually the end of this month, I'll be out there in person. So if you see this beautiful face walking the strip, feel free to grab me, and I'm happy to have a coffee or a beer and talk through this some more.
This has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us. I knew you'd have a lot of great points and good things for us to think about, and you didn't let me down. And it's fun brainstorming with you on these topics. And thanks for all the good questions. OKRs, I'll finish up with the statement I always make. In large enterprises with these kinds of challenges, having successful implementation of strategic initiatives that cross business unit and functions, OKR's killer feature is horizontal alignment to increase the dismal success rates typical in large enterprises of cross-cutting initiatives. And so, OKRs are your answer for horizontal alignment.
I think we leave it at that. Thank you both for the time today, and thanks to everybody for coming and joining us. And we look forward to meeting with you in the future. And with that, I will turn us off.